welcome you to this evening's City Council study session. I'm going to call the meeting to order. We cannot move forward on a consensus, but we have a couple council members that are running a little bit late and should be here, but we can go ahead with the informational piece. So we're going to begin with agenda item 1, the April 2018 financial report. Finance and Administrative Services Director Kathleen Rinkel is here to review the April 2018 monthly financial report. Have
Good evening. How are you?
Doing well, and you?
Good. So I'd like to be able to start off with saying have very strong performance still through April. Our revenues exceed our expenditures by a little bit over $3 million. Very good place to be. And our year-to-date revenues through the month are better than the budget and also better than we were year-to-date at this point last year. Year-to-date expenditures are a little lower than budget and also better than they were this time last year by a little bit. So with that, I'll go into the first page. Now, there will be some pages that I'm going to hit, and some pages have not changed since the last time you've seen the comprehensive report, so we'll just skip over those since you've seen them before. So on page 1, I'd like to point to the little blue and red graphs over on the left-hand side in that chart, and you can see that our revenues are exceeding our 5-year average. And it's actually by 3.1 percentage points, which is pretty good size. The expenditures are a little bit lower than the red line. It's kind of hard to tell because this graph is kind of tiny, by 1.1 percentage points. So we're in better condition than our 5-year average as well. On page 2, I'd like to point out in the first graph at the top of the page, if you look at the third column of numbers over percent budget, that we're at 36.5% collected, and we're only 33% through the year. So that's where we're seeing how good we are there. On the expenditures, at the very same column, graph right below it, it's 30%, again, at 33% of the year. So we're running a little bit under where we would normally be, budget-wise. Now, I would like to also point out that we have 3 areas that are slightly over. I am expecting each one of them to come back into line by the end of the year, but we will keep a close eye on them to make sure. One is the legislative, which is the council, and that's because of the one-time aid to agencies which hit in 1 month. And what that does is that puts most of your expenditures front-loaded, and then we kind of ease into the rest of the budget over the rest of the year. But we'll keep a close eye on that because we do have the special elections that will cause some additional expenses.
So the special elections haven't been paid for yet, or were there expenses that we've already incurred because of the first special election?
Not many, if any, of the expenses have come in. I'll have to okay. And Stephanie is kind of shaking her head in agreement. So
thank you.
Mm-hmm. The CMO, we have the fire contract, which is paid 1 month in advance, so that will always look over until we get to the end of the year and don't pay anything in December. And HR had a one-time charge for the change management training, and that hit this month. So we'll see theirs level out as well. Okay. On page 3, what I'd like to point out by area, we've got some comments over here so you can see where a business relocated, 1 added, 1 left, that sort of thing. I can't get any more detail here because we are required to keep the confidentiality of the businesses per ordinance. So this is about as much information as I can provide. Area 3 and 4, where we had the 1 business relocate, it was between those 2 areas. If you add those 2 areas together, we're actually still ahead of where we were last year by almost $78,000. Now, the next several pages are the same. They have not changed. So we'll move to page 11. And what I'd like to point out is at the bottom, and I know this graph hasn't changed, but I did want to remind everybody that the portions that fund are different from the different areas really haven't changed that much from 2013 to 2017. So we're still looking at Area 7, which is now 7 and 14, carrying most of the weight of the city in proportion to the rest of them. And with that, I'd like to switch to page 12, where you can see area year by year, and whether they've come up a little bit or gone down a little bit. And what I'd like to point to is Area 7 being our strongest, and it's still coming ahead of where it was last year slightly at this point, even though we've broken out Area 14. So it's still very lucrative for us. Provides a real good visual. Then we'll skip to page 19. And where I'd like to point your attention to is the bottom graph. And it's the, I'm going to say the 5th column of numbers where we've got your percentages. And I just wanted to point out that the vehicle use tax, now this is funding our public improvement fund, these pieces. The vehicle use tax, notice it's gone down 23% where it was last year. And I think everybody's gotten done buying their cars after the recession. So I think that's why we're seeing that drop, as people are feeling a little more comfortable where they are vehicle-wise. But notice the building use tax, how much that's gone up. So we're seeing a lot of building. On page 20, this basically shows you where we expect the ending fund balances to be for all the different funds. General fund being at the top, and then the rest of the funds being below. I'd like to point out that they are all positive at this point, and in a fairly strong position for all of them. And that's really all of the numbers that have done any kind of changing. The rest of them are a restatement of what you've seen before in most part. Any questions?
Any questions or comments from council? Councilmember Cuesta.
Thank you. And I'm just trying to get back to the correct page here, if you will bear with me. It was page 3, and you might have said all that you can, but Area 4 had one business relocate to Area 3. Mm-hmm. You're unable to share that business?
To maintain the confidentiality of the business, I am not.
Thank you. Okay. And same with Area 5, the one business that opened, you're unable to share that as well?
That is true.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Rinkel. Moving on to agenda item 2, accessory dwelling units, town hall follow-up. Planner John Voboril is here to perhaps go over our accessory dwelling unit meeting, our town hall. Good evening, Mr. Voboril.
Good evening, Mayor Pro Tem. Tonight we're here to discuss the results of the accessory dwelling unit town hall meeting that was held last Thursday evening. I think it went very well. It was very successful, and I want to thank Mayor Pro Tem Russell for running the meeting in a very fine manner, and as well as the rest of the council members for their very good questions they asked. I'd also like to thank also the technical assistance from the city staff. That was very helpful in keeping the meeting running smoothly, especially the sound. And I'd also like to thank the citizen participants in the meeting. I thought whether they're pro or con, they're very respectful, and they showed a lot of sincerity and politeness in their answers and their testimony. After the meeting, the next day, I quickly transcribed the sticky notes for you and then emailed those off to you. So I hope that you had some time to reflect on that over the long weekend. Just one other thing I'd like to mention is that I received an article from 9 News today that the city of Centennial, our neighbor to the south, is also getting a lot of pressure for accessory dwelling units from their citizens, and they will be taking that up next year. For tonight's study session, staff would like to hear each council person's takeaways from the meetings and discuss your insights and feelings with your fellow council members. Staff also believes that this is the appropriate time for council persons to lay down a few of their cards as to which of the 5 options they are currently leaning toward and which of the 5 options they do not support. And finally, staff is asking council members to try to come up with a consensus for moving forward with a first reading and public hearing. The Planning and Zoning Commission recommendation of option number 1 would come forward as the proposed council bill, which would either be voted on by council as is or would be amended by council to reflect a preferred alternative option, maybe one of these other 4 options. And so with that, I would like to open the floor to city council members.
Councilmember Questa.
Just in terms of not having the full council here, this is such a critical issue. I'm wondering if we should have everyone present.
I actually think we should.
I would like to hear their thoughts, and I'd like to share mine with them as well.
Right. Councilmember Barentine?
I think when staff is asking at a study session for us to lay down our cards or to go ahead and start with one of the options, I thought we were going to have some more discussion about each one of them, but we need to have everybody here with that request.
I absolutely agree. So, Councilmember Martinez, do you have any?
Do we know if the other council members are going to join us tonight, or?
Yes, both Councilmember Olson and Councilmember Wink have let staff know that they would be running a little late.
Okay.
So.
I guess we could rearrange the order of the discussion. However, I think it would also be important to have their thoughts on the prioritization of the strategic plan as well.
Absolutely.
So.
Let me take a break for a few
Recess?
Okay. All right.
Do we know what time they're going to be here?
Actually, did Councilmember Olson say around?
Yeah, she said 15 to 20 minutes.
Take a break so I can go to the bathroom officially.
Yes. All right. We are recessed until the next council member arrives.
That's a long distance appointment.
Thank you.
I have to say, the ADU meeting, how courteous everyone was, no matter what. Really impressive.
It was very good.
I jabbed at it 4 or 5 times, made it turn off.
Is Cheryl not here?
No. Oh.
Are you ready? Okay. All right, we'll call the meeting back to order. And if Mr. Voboril would come back up. And actually, Mr. Voboril, would you mind just recapping briefly?
Yes. All right, well, before the recess, I was called up, and I just wanted to thank council members as well as Mayor Pro Tem Russell and the citizens on a great meeting that we had, very successful. Also, I just wanted to mention also that I had transcribed the sticky map notes for you all the next day and sent that out. And also that I mentioned that the city of Centennial is getting a bunch of pressure from citizens for ADUs and is going to look at that issue next year. And then I kind of laid out what we're kind of looking for in tonight's study session, that we'd like to hear council's personal takeaways from the meetings and their feelings and insights and discuss those with your fellow council members. And we also would like to see if council would be amenable to laying down some of their cards in terms of which options they are leaning towards right now and which options they are not acceptable. And then we would also really hope if we could maybe get some consensus to move forward with a first reading and a public hearing. The Planning and Zoning Commission recommendation of option 1 would come forward as a council bill, which would either be voted on council as is or would be amended by council to reflect a preferred alternative option. And at that point, I opened it up to council.
Thank you. Would anyone like to start us off? Councilmember Cuesta.
I'm not sure if I'm at the point of commentary. I did have some follow-up questions based upon what came out in the presentation. I think you might be able to give me some insight there. And thank you for putting it on, too. I thought it was very productive. I heard some really good feedback from citizens that attended, so I appreciate all the work that staff put into it as well. Somebody has to occupy one of the two dwellings, be it the primary dwelling or the ADU. But there is no restriction on how that unoccupied dwelling can be used, correct? It could be a family member. It could be a long-term rental, or it could be a short-term rental in Airbnb. There are no restrictions on that at this point, the way it's currently written.
Right now, the city does not allow for short-term rentals in our code. Well, we do know that people are doing that, but it is illegal. So at this time, that would be an illegal use. In terms of family members, yes. If you decided you didn't want to rent the ADU, you could use it for your own personal family.
that one.
And let me. And will you define long-term rental for me again as opposed to short-term? What is that threshold?
A long-term rental is anything more than 30 days.
Okay. Thank you. And can you go over the corporate ownership structure again? And I certainly see how folks may do that where you put the ownership of it into an LLC. But was it 50, somebody who's at least, call it the LLC, 51% member in that LLC would have to be an occupant in one of the two dwellings?
Somebody pointed out to us that we would be better off putting 50% ownership. Somebody with a 50% ownership stake, either personally or as a representative of an LLC, would be required to, just as a ordinary homeowner would be, to live on the property for 9 months of the year.
So they wouldn't have to have membership or ownership in that LLC. The LLC could just dub you representative and you get to serve as the owner-occupant.
Yes, I believe so.
Why 50 over 51%?
Because when somebody pointed out to us that is pretty uncommon to have someone own 51%, 49%, and so we've kind of thought, well, yeah, we agree with that, so we changed to 50%.
Okay, thank you. The figure was used in the forum that the current Inglewood infrastructure can support 50,000 people. What infrastructure does that entail that is currently at that 50,000 person capacity?
That is our water supply and our sewer system.
How was that 50,000 figure reached?
Actually, it has to do with the planning for Inglewood's water system in the 1950s. At that time, the city council felt that it was very important to try to achieve water independence and didn't want to be subservient to Denver Water. So that was a goal of the city's to purchase water rights and develop its own system. And they, of course, part of their vision was that they didn't want to be the growth of the city stifled by Denver Water in any way. And so that they, in their original planning, they actually wanted to plan for future growth. And I don't know exactly how they came to the 50,000 figure, but they sized the system to serve a population of 50,000.
And I thank you for the answer. And that's what I was wondering is, have they allotted X citizen should use X amount of water per year, or X household should use X amount of water per year? So you're not sure how they reached that 50K number? And 50K is such a nice round number, too, that it seemed coincidental.
No, I have not. I have never seen the actual planning documents. This is all what I have heard from the utilities department.
Thank you. That is it for now. Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Thank you, Mr.
Thank
Voboril.
you. Other questions? Councilmember Olson?
Thanks for waiting so much time. I also agree that last week was great. Thank you for the work that you all did to make that informative for people. I love the questions Member Price is asking. I did want to ask about the 50,000. It is based on from my understanding, it's not on. That's what red means. So when I've asked this question before, I have heard that it was based on the actual usage of water and sewer per person at that point in time, which would be a lot more than what we currently do under more careful usage, which I think we've moved towards over time, and when we know that it's gone down. Is there a formula that we could ask for people within the departments that figure this out to reconfirm that 50,000 amount? That's just a general idea. I don't think the ADUs, we're not going to increase by 15,000 people by ADUs, that's for sure.
No,
but it would be helpful.
I think the possibility would be more significant is the growth of apartments.
Right.
Yes.
So, but it would be helpful to, if we have thrown that out there several times, and I think it'd be worth, I don't know who all we would get to do that, but to reconfirm that as a number that really can hold both water and sewer, that would be useful.
I will get in touch with the Director of Utilities.
And the other thing, the question I had too was on what's ownership. And I know you just said you heard that 51% is not the norm, but not the norm for what? For an LLC only, or?
Most people just don't. It just doesn't. They typically buy properties equally. So what would we do if we required 51% and the two entities or two people were 50-50 partners? Then that doesn't. None of them is 51%. So someone pointed out to us and thought, yeah, you're right, and we changed it.
I can see why that is, and it seems to me like a 51% or more would have a bigger stake in the property and what happens, and that's one of the reasons why you'd want it more than 50.
I think that was probably how we thought about it originally, but I don't think it's practical.
You don't think it's practical, okay. The last question I had, let me see. Let me go through this. Go ahead on to someone else. I know I have another one.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Martinez?
Thank you. I wanted to also thank staff for a great meeting and providing all this information several times over and being there that night to help us answer questions. I think that was really helpful, and loved the feedback from people. And one of the overarching comments or themes that I saw from people was, taking care of our family members. And I think that's one thing that's really unique about Inglewood is that people are always thinking about that. How can I help my aging parents or whatever? And I saw that as a theme throughout the evening with the comments. So I think, especially from that perspective, I really am in favor of the ADUs, and I'm in favor of option 1 or option 4. And thanks again for all the staff work and time to make these things happen.
Thank you. Councilmember Barentine?
On the rest of your questions, if you wanted to finish up your time.
No, go ahead. I do know what I want to ask. Go ahead.
The corporate ownership, while I understand why that's concerning, I don't think it's enough that it's going to affect it, whether it's 50 or 51%. The infrastructure, I agree with Councilmember Olson. We really need to find out what that formula is, and I think that the issue isn't just for the availability of the service or the water, but the infrastructure for the pipes, the rest of the system, not just what's on that property. As we're switching some of them over, but I would like to know what the formula is. It's an assumption that they didn't think, back in the 50s, they thought we were going to be flying around in cars like the Jetsons, so maybe they thought we wouldn't be using a dropper full of water at the time, so maybe they thought we'd be even more than we are, so it would be interesting to see what that formula is. The issue you brought up on the short-term rentals being illegal, to Councilmember Cuesta's question, is that we already know it's illegal and we're not enforcing it. I mean, it's illegal, and people are pretty out there about knowing that it's going on, and we're not enforcing it, which brought up questions that evening on how we're going to enforce the ownership piece of this. Now, the current one that's over at Floyd on the old Shrine property is a PDU. It's not an ADU. They're ADU type things, but what might be an ADU, but it is a PDU. It is zoned on its own. So some of the people thought that we had already allowed ADUs, and that is not the case. That was a zoning for a PDU on its own. So while it's being used as an example of ADUs is probably just because the construction type of it, but it is not an ADU. But it is concerning that people were bringing up that there's a business in the back and the massage parlor, and that somebody's already full-time renting out an Airbnb, and they go, if you guys already know that it's not legal and we can't enforce that, then the whole question becomes the ownership. And to me, the long list of ownership requirements and enforcement on the property becomes the problem then. I think what gets brought up is we need to have a discussion on whether if having ADUs is a deal breaker if it's not going to be owner occupied on one end of the property or the other, either the ADU or the other, that you're not going to have an owner on that property. If that's a deal breaker, then we have a huge problem, because I don't see how we're going to ever enforce this. If it's not, and people go like ADUs are now, and I believe ADUs probably started out with the same issue, that they should be owner occupied, and over time it wasn't enforceable. They got grandfathered in, and they want to stay grandfathered in because they don't have any of the ownership requirements on there. If ownership isn't really a deal breaker, and we think people could rent or investors to come in or corporations could own or whatever, and that they're going to take care of the property and be okay, then I think that we should have that discussion. If it's important, if it truly is a deal breaker for people that they don't want ADUs in this community unless there's owner occupied, then we have some very serious conversations that we need to have before we go forward on how exactly we would enforce that. Since we are already admitting that we have enforcement problems on non-conforming uses already. It's just a postcard that somebody sends in and says that they're there. I don't know whether we have the money or the manpower or the will to go ahead and start checking on whether people are living in their house for 9 months a year or not, whether they're on break, whether they're on a nursing home, whether they're taking a medical leave. It's a pretty onerous situation. So if we come to the conclusion, in my opinion, that we don't think owner-occupied makes a difference to the community, then ADUs take on a whole different conversation. If the only way the community is truly considering ADUs is because we're giving them this ownership piece of it, then we need to address how we're going to enforce that and whether we can realistically make that happen or not.
Thank you. Councilmember Olson.
Well,
I will add in, but go ahead. You can do yours first.
And at some point, hopefully everybody will chime in, because I would like an answer to that, because it's really important for me on moving forward.
Could I ask you which way you want it to be? You want it to be owner-occupied or not?
From my district, people would prefer that it be owner-occupied. I think there is an assumption, and it goes anecdotally, but I think generally across the board people can assume that people that have some ownership in a property tend to take a little bit better care of it. That's not always the case. We can anecdotally bring up anything, but they tend to believe that, and so they would prefer that they were owner-occupied. Right now, from what I'm hearing back, is that they don't want it in the R1, in the single-family areas, and so that would... some of them would be interested in taking a look at kind of seeing how it works more in the major areas that we've got where it would be transitional, but to just open it up citywide, they think would be a little fast to see what's going on with it. And that would, I think that's kind of it. So it's kind of either not there at all or kind of stage it out and see how it works a little bit. And I think the owner-occupied thing is the deal breaker. I mean, they just don't see the. I'm not sure. So if anybody has a suggestion on how we would ever enforce that stuff, because to say the county would or the IRS would or whatever, that's how we got into this. And the problem is that if we do it and we allow it, then in my opinion, it would be a takings to undo it. And I would not be for grandfathering people in. I would be for leaving that be, because then we've upped the value potentially to some of the properties and not others. So it's very iffy to me. I want to be very cautious about opening it up. So I'm interested in what you guys have to say.
So I'll just pick up on that then too. I've been so the 50% thing from several people was an important thing. That's why I asked about it. They wanted it to be more than that. They want people to be owning and committed to the property so that it stays at least under the eye of someone who cares about it. And the more care, the higher the percentage is what some people perceive. So that's why I asked about that, if that's the norm. I agree that I do think that that is a key piece. I definitely, if we go forward with this, want it to be owner-occupied in one of the units. I think that that's the safest way to begin. In terms of enforcement, I know that I have called on Airbnb in the past when it's become difficult, and I had not been aware of the one that was on Downing or on Floyd and, yeah.
Logan?
Yeah. So I didn't even notice the sign until the other night. And I went by and went, oh my goodness, there's a sign there. So my question is, and this has to do with option 2 and 3 too, is how do we enforce and how do we assess? Because even option 2 and 3, which are the more conservative ones, are requesting that there be some assessment done. So I don't know that we're very good at doing that. And what would that even look like? So could we get some information on whether Airbnb and other forms of short-term rentals have been enforced in the last several months? Because I know I've called on some before and they've been enforced. People have gone and neighbors have actually spoken to people who own the homes where it is going on and have made it pretty clear that they don't like this and they're going to keep reporting. So I don't know if, I mean, that's a hard thing to keep doing. But there has to be some strategy for enforcement if we're not going to do Airbnb and other like things. So I don't know if you have an answer to that.
Well, the only thing I could say is that Council has asked Community Development to also, and Planning and Zoning Commission, to look at short-term rentals. And so we have had probably about 5 or 6 study sessions so far with that issue. So I think what they're looking to do is the idea would be to acknowledge that it would be hard to prevent these totally. I think they're looking at ways to allow people to do that, short-term rentals, but in a very much more controlled, regulated manner.
Right now, we don't get anything from it.
No, not now.
I actually think Airbnb is violating.
They are.
They're out of, I mean, not just the homeowner, but Airbnb is in violation of the city right now because they have their signs up. And I had never seen that anywhere else, and I guess I just don't go that way. I just didn't see that property. The other question that I just mentioned was option 2 and 3. Talk about this option the option would allow City Council to assess how well the AD regulations work over the course of a few years. I mean, how do we even go about doing that? What is the criteria for assessing? How is it going? I would want those to be pretty clear so that we're not just saying, well, it's going great, depending on whoever thinks it's going great, and it's not going well for those who didn't want them.
Well, I think the key for the council sounds like it is the owner occupancy. How can that be enforced? And I think that would be the key criteria is are people building these and then a few years later we're experiencing significant violations of that. And that would be the key criteria.
So who would be doing that? It would be code enforcement that would have to be keeping track of this all? Or who would do it?
I think it would be a kind of a joint venture between, as many things are, between code and community development. We would play a certain side of, doing the mailing, the registration, mailing annually, and maybe some of our detective work. Sometimes we do know a lot about the city, and we it may pop up to us. Something might pop up that, something seems a little wrong here. And then we might contact code to follow through.
So I'm more in favor of 1 because it's cleaner, but I don't want to go forward anything till we've got the enforcement thing figured out. I don't want things to just pop up. I mean, I think it's going to be, I think we have to have a stronger way of keeping track in a very regular manner and not just leave it to...
I just want to throw this out there that so most cities who do have accessory dwelling units, it is an owner occupancy requirement. And what they mostly have done is that it is enforced basically by your neighbors. Your neighbors are your best bet they will notice this right away and they will make the call to the city to inform the city. And that is the way most places, the way they do self-enforcement.
You're going to add to this?
Well, good evening, Mayor, members of council. John just made the point that I was going to make. I think one of the things that we do is we endeavor through the agreements that people would sign relative to being compliant with our ADU regulations, and that they are signing up for the self-registry and making sure that they comply, and we do this on an annual basis. We do that for other things that now, and we would expect that through the ADU process as well. Like a lot of other things in code enforcement, as John is exactly right, I think a lot of cities do this on a complaint basis. So the enforcement about the bad actors would be self-evident, and we would count on the neighbors to be that first level of policing, and that they would call in, and then we would take it from there in terms of being proactive and reaching out to those property owners and either citing them or getting the conditions fixed that they may be in violation of. So we would see this as being just like things like weeds and fences and that type of thing. It would be kind of on that same level of roster of complaints that people could have with the actors in their neighborhoods if there are ADUs that are perceived to be falling out of compliance with the rules.
Go ahead. Did you?
Are there any examples of a city being a little bit more proactive with that? I mean, weeds is different than people not living in the ADU that shouldn't be there or not having owner occupancy.
The only experience that I've dealt with is university towns that tend to have a huge number of rentals. They'll employ inspection staff that do that type of rental housing inspection. I think some cities have adapted that to ADUs, but I think most cities have it being, these are the rules. You are signing affidavits, or you're complying every year with the conditions of the rules. You're attesting to that, and that if there are issues, then those tend to be reported by somebody in the neighborhood, and then the normal course of code enforcement would take it from there.
With that, I actually would like to weigh in also. I agree absolutely with the fact that they need to be owner-occupied. I agree with the enforcement piece. And the concern that I have with what you have just outlined is not working currently in our city, either with code enforcement or with the police department. We have an 8-foot fence that was a result of not getting along with the neighbors. The police told the people to go to the building department. The building department tell the people to build an 8-foot fence, and we have an 8-foot fence that is not compliant. Until we get these pieces figured out, we're going to create more problems for ourselves than we already have. So I think the enforcement piece is huge. I think there was something else that I had also. The one other thing that I'm thinking about is I have had complaints from constituents about people calling the building department and wanting inspections, and they have been told that we are short-staffed. They do not, that the building and community development do not have the staff to get inspections done that we're currently doing. If we move forward with this, how are we going to even provide inspections for moving forward with this? So those are some questions that I think need to be answered, because if we're already overloaded, if we go ahead and move forward on this, we're going to create an even bigger problem for ourselves. So that's where I'm at right now. Councilmember Barentine?
I would share her concern. We had community development department. I would hate to see you take on any more burden. We've already had, what, 4, 5 planning and zoning meetings were canceled because community development department was too overwhelmed to even do when the planning and zoning board meetings, when that's a very integral part of your job and responsibility. So I would hate to see you guys take on more when I think that maybe some other issues that need to be addressed with that to kind of get that, lighten that up for you guys. But I share her concern that maybe it's already at a tipping point right now, and taking on more might not be a wise idea. And the issue with that Councilmember Olson brought up, I would agree, it is different than, people are different than weeds. You can see a weed, you can measure a weed. People don't stand still long enough for you to go ahead. I mean, when you start putting the burden on the neighbors, and somebody can go ahead and do something, whether it's legal or not, by the tolerance of their neighbors, is not a good way to run the city. It's not working for code enforcement, and I don't think it would work for this. I don't think it will give people the level of comfort that they're looking for with this, and stability, and they want it to be even-handed. And the law isn't even-handed when you're relying on neighbors to complain. The other piece of this is that you have several issues in this owner-occupied that allow for both units to go ahead and be rented, which is if somebody is in a medical situation, a nursing home. And while they are, and I think that's just one of them, both units can be rented. How in the world are we supposed to expect the neighbors or the city to go ahead and get medical records from somebody on when they went to a nursing home, or what's going on with that? I don't think they want to see any more. We're already getting a lot of pushback with code, and that it's not proactive, that it's reactive to people complaining, and that really doesn't make people feel good. And I don't want to add another thing where we're expecting that the law is only followed by neighbors who are diligent and expecting their neighbors to enforce it. So it is a piece that has to come back a little bit more solid for, if, like I said, if we're going to go ahead and make this a criteria. However, I'm willing to have the discussion, or at least have the discussion with the public, that if it truly isn't a deal with them, that they care that it's owner-occupied, then we can have that discussion. I would think it might not go well, because a lot of the issues with the current ADUs not being owner-occupied have brought up issues that kind of was the catalyst for wanting to make these owner-occupied in the first place. So we really need to kind of batten that down a little. And we have a process that needs to be looked at right now that isn't making people comfortable with how we're handling things with code enforcement and the police. And so we need to make sure that we've addressed those areas first, and maybe in that process we'll come up with some answers on how we can do something that's enforceable. But I just don't see how it's enforceable right now. So really looking for some more information to come back on how we would do that piece and whether it's important or not.
Thank you. Councilmember Martinez.
Thank you. And everyone I've spoken with and heard from, the owner occupancy requirement is really important, and most of the people I've heard from want it because they are owners and they want to, have family members a place to stay. So I think that is really, really important. I am concerned about the enforcement. I don't want the onus to be on the neighbors. I don't think that's fair, and that is not proactive, and that will, I think, hurt our neighborliness that we have already, and that's what people love about. One thing that people love about our community, I don't think the onus should be on the neighbors to kind of tattle on their neighbors, because like you said, no one's going to know, it's not appropriate. So I think if we can come up with a way to make it more streamlined and not so burdensome to the neighbors and the staff, I think we could find a way to work it out. But it is important, but I don't think the onus should be on the neighbors. I definitely think the weight of it should be on the staff, if anybody, not the neighbors.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Councilmember Costa.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. To me, a fundamental component of this entire conversation with every option was owner occupancy. I think if we take that out of it, then we've changed the conversation that we've had in good faith with the citizens up to this point. So I think that's built in. Each one of these options to me was done under that understanding that there would be an owner occupying one of the two dwellings. So I think it's tough to switch gears on that at this point without really bringing that back in for public comment, because I can see some people changing their idea if that wasn't a component. A secondary thing that comes to mind for me, I believe this was described as revenue neutral at the ADU forum. Is that correct? And then if we do get into enforcement fees, that of course would have an expense with it as well, which takes away the neutrality for revenue. Now, I certainly appreciate that if this brings more citizens in, they'll do more shopping in Inglewood. That's good for the sales tax base. But there'd have to be a price tag on the enforcement as well for us to understand. I think just so that people know what that expense would be. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Any more questions or comments? Councilmember Olson?
It's probably not anything new. I would like to. I'd like to approach this with the question of how can we make this work well and not create negativity in communities. I think Member Martinez is right in suggesting, and I think others too, that we don't want our citizens to be enforcing it. We want it to be a system that helps enforce it and make it easy to enforce. So if we could find some ways to do that, and maybe it is inspections, and then maybe there is a charge for having an ADU. Maybe there's a fee that we charge to help offset the staff costs for doing that. None of this comes without a cost for making sure that we abide by them. That's how cities that do Airbnb, same thing. You know, there's a fee there that's coming in that makes that possible to have and regulated. So if we don't think there are going to be a whole lot, maybe the fee can be small. I don't know. I would like to, at least for a while, entertain, okay, if we say yes, what will make this really work so that it actually is not burdensome for the neighbors and takes us forward as a community. But I don't see teeth in that part of the piece of this yet, which would make it even easier for me to say, yeah, let's go forward. But I still am in favor of one, I think. I thought maybe 2 and 3 could be. I loved that young man that came up and said, just make everybody mad. You know, he was so.
That was funny.
It was great. I wanted to say, sign up for board and commission. I'm concerned that we wouldn't have in 2 and 3 an assessment process to determine whether or not anything was working well. But I would want that in 1 as well, that we know there's some way to determine whether or not, if we wanted to go to the whole city, what would be the criteria that we decide it was successful.
Do you have any examples of criteria that you would?
Well, you mentioned one already.
Right.
I'm trying. I mean, it might be a staffing thing. I mean, I don't know how true some of the reports are of problems in community development of not getting things attended to in a timely manner. I've heard some things said that maybe it's another department. I don't know, but I think we need to have a full assessment of what are our staff. Are they overworked, and do we need to hire another person? Maybe we need another person to help with some of this overload, which is what I was asking in the budget process. Is there going to be another person we're asking for in the budget? I don't mind doing that if we want to make this work. We just need to know.
I agree. Councilmember Barentine.
I wanted to chime in on your question. I think some of the reasons that we wanted owner-occupied are the problems that the current ADUs caused. There were upkeep, there were renters going in, it was owners that weren't being responsive to problems or issues that were going on, and still aren't. So I'd like to kind of go back and address exactly why planning and zoning put that requirement in there, and I think we'll get some of our criteria of what we could go ahead and put as some other requirements in there. The issue that you brought up about charging a fee was actually brought up by that woman who said that what happens in Boulder, and you're right, people cost money. I don't think that it's revenue neutral. Otherwise, everybody'd have a family of 10, and they'd be better off than the family with only 1 child. They're not. So we have to be realistic about, how we're approaching this and just get all of the information. I had several people who were interested in my area who said if it has to be owner occupied, I don't want to do it. Forget it. Because I understand that the people who want to do it now are living there and they have specific situations and issues that they want to do. And I will get older and I will die. My son will get my house. I'm not going to stay alive forever. So the situation in my home will change, as it will for everybody. And so when I'm setting things up for now, that's not going to be the situation in 20 years from now. And so to burden that property with the requirement then, once they put all of that expense in and put that in, and maybe the neighbors didn't want it or did, but they've got it now, and then you're going to have a lot of people coming to council going, I can't sell this, or I can't make the money on it because the people don't want to do the owner-occupied. So it's that level of comfort of people knowing that once we do this, that it's really got sustainability to what we're creating, and that we're not just creating a here and now issue or solution or enforcement, but that it can really be sustainable through a period of time. And I am concerned about that. But I think a lot of the issues with the current ADUs might give us some guidelines on why people are so adamant, as you said, Councilmember Quest. I believe you're correct. I think that so far in this process, it's been a given that we were guaranteeing and that there'd be an owner-occupied piece of it. And I think they're just starting to come to grips with whether we're actually capable of doing that or not. As far as additional staffing for any of the departments, I'm sure that the city manager is already working on that piece of it, and those issues came up, and we didn't have a meeting, and that was October, November, December, maybe September. Yeah, September. So I'm sure that you've already been looking at those issues for staffing and why those have happened. Hopefully that's already in the process of being resolved. So I'm sure we'll get that. But I do agree with Councilmember Olson that we need to be very cautious about doing any mid-year decisions on staffing until we have a whole picture. So that being said, because I do think that we have some concerns about those two departments in particular. So thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Olson.
So, Manager, can you give us some update of what you think is happening? Are some of the claims that have been made, are they old news or are they current news? Or what's your view of what's happening right now? And how would this affect the departments and being able to?
Yeah, certainly. I think that any proposal to move forward with ADUs, we need to look at what policy decisions you're making. If, in fact, you're going to propose that the city have a kind of a robust process or permitting beyond the deed restriction, which I think was part of that, in addition to checking on that annually. Right now, it's an exercise in sending out the postcards as has been described. As far as the building concerns have been, this is the first I've heard of that. The reason that we don't believe we have concerns with that because we have an overflow contract right now with AC West, and they provide us with additional inspections. And so when somebody calls in and says they need an inspection, there's nobody that I've heard of that's been denied an inspection within a reasonable period of time. If our inspectors can't get to it, we have a program in place and a process where we reach out to CWest to do overflow inspection as well as overflow plan review and design. To my knowledge, there's not been anybody who's been denied an opportunity to discuss matters with staff and or our contractor to obtain a permit. So I think I'm kind of confused by that, and I'd like to drill down on that. If you've got specific examples, please, by all means, pass those along to me so that I can look into it and find out why we're not providing superlative service to those who are trying to do business with us. But as far as staffing goes, I think we want to see in which direction the council will go with this particular item so that I can plan effectively to determine administratively how we're going to manage this. Is it going to be, as has been suggested this evening, to look at a combination of follow-up on deed restriction on an annual basis versus neighbors reporting, hey, this guy or these people are running a VRBO out of their unit, out of their home. So we just need to understand from a policy perspective what direction council would go.
Well, so if we said we do want another step in the process, we do want some sort of inspection, maybe once a year, could you handle it currently where we are with our staffing?
It'll be tight. I think that would not be something I would tie up a higher dollared building inspector with, quite frankly, unless we had concerns about the quality of what's going on in a unit. But of course, if somebody's going to build one, it would have to go through the permitting process to begin with. It'd be more of an administrative function, just sending somebody to do some checking with the county with ownership records versus who's actually at a particular parcel. That would be a new person. We would probably have to do that to make that happen.
Full-time person?
Depends on the number of units that we have.
Right.
I mean, right now it's been posited that we have roughly 75 units that are ADUs currently in the community.
There are 180 existing
Okay.
historical units, but so we've had interest from the community forums that 70 different people
Right.
would like to build, and so probably over a period of 10 years, you would see 10 a year, and we would expect no more than 100 over 10 years.
So we wouldn't need someone full-time to begin with. It would just be an add-on probably for someone
Yeah,
or an
you're right. Probably more of a part-time issue, but they need access to county records as well as being able to go into the field and check with each of these residents.
So I think Council Member Barentine was talking about something that happened in the fall with some adjustment in the offices. Can you update us on that?
That's more of a stand. That was more germane to the Planning and Zoning Commission not having meetings. And at the time, I think Mr. Power can probably come up and address that. But we have addressed that now.
Yeah, we've already talked about
They're
that. I thought
meeting on a regular
yeah.
basis, but
I thought she was, and maybe I've misunderstood. I thought it was something to do with staffing in the office.
well, that was part of the reason too. Is that again, I think staff, like anybody else, did not want to have a meeting for the sake of saying we had a meeting. If in fact there wasn't something that was driving the bus, and at the time, the preponderance or the majority of the applications coming in were being dealt with administratively by staff. It wasn't something that was required by our Unified Development Code to go towards the Planning and Zoning Commission. That's not to say that the Planning and Zoning Commission didn't have other things to work upon, but the decision was made with the previous chairperson as well as the staff liaison to the Planning and Zoning Commission to not have a meeting during those times. And we've obviously worked through that now and understand that that they need to have a work plan, and they've been working upon that and have been faithfully executing on that in the meeting on a regular basis.
Thank you. That's helpful. I misunderstood. I think one of my other questions has to do with the fees, and Boulder has one. I've seen them in other places across the country. Did the Planning and Zoning look at fees as a possible way?
I tried to look at that on the Boulder's website today, and what they do have is, so they have a multifamily rental inspection program, and all multifamily properties have to be inspected once every 4 years, and the fee is fairly low. It's only $105.
105? But, so they just include it in multifamily, so ADUs are part of multifamily.
Yes,
Oh,
anything
that
that
makes
is a
sense.
rental.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Martinez?
Thank you. My question relates to the 180 existing ADUs. Remind me, they will have the opportunity to opt into these new rules should we accept them, correct? The new...
No, that's not true. Basically, the way that we were looking at it is that the existing ADUs would just continue as they were.
Okay.
And that is something that would be a whole other subject that we didn't want to muddy the waters with these new ADUs.
Okay.
And so if it would be council's pleasure to then, once you had resolved what you want to do with new ADUs, if you wanted then to study, should we continue, the options for old ADUs, then that would be a whole new subject to study.
Okay, so they're kind of going to be treated differently, separately.
Just as they are today.
Okay.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Information. Could you please explain why would it muddy the waters?
You get it starts to become a more complicated issue. The bigger the issue, the more facets it has, the more complicated it gets, and the harder it is to make decisions.
Why would it muddy the water to go ahead and bring the current ADUs into compliance with what we're doing now?
They're a different building stock. Some of them were garages that were converted. The quality varies up and down. There's just a lot. It's just still a different can of worms.
But if we brought them into owner occupancy, we could at least go ahead and allow them then to have the option to upgrade, which they can't now. They're complaining that they can't do anything with the building and make it more habitable.
You can maintain it. You can maintain it. You just can't expand it.
Well, I've heard complaints of upgrades, so maybe they need to have a little bit more information on exactly what they can do and what they can't. But if we even consider just bringing them into the owner occupancy piece of it, but then I understand that that's kind of the deal killer for them a lot of times. So I just wanted to know. I would like some more information on what. I think that's a good question that Councilmember Martinez is bringing up. What would that look like if we just did it all at one time instead of having this patchwork of all of these people under all of these different rules? So I think that's a good idea. And I would like to know what would be the concerns of the people that currently have ADUs and coming in under that new rule, even partially, and at least being like owner occupied, some piece of this. So I'd like a little bit more information on that because it does get crazy. I think that's kind of why the PEDs were an issue because you don't want to rezone 3 blocks at a time all over the property. And so when you have everybody under all these different rules, it makes it even harder to enforce. So I think her question was well stated. I'd like to get that information as well.
Thank you. Councilmember Martinez.
I just had a follow-up to that. And I think it makes sense to not mandate that the existing units follow these new rules. They've been the properties this way for a long time, since the 40s and 50s, and I think it might be quite jarring and unfair to those property owners to mandate now that they have to follow these rules. But I think it would be nice to allow them the option to opt in if we accept this, if they want to. Also, to our earlier discussion, I think with that though, if with the neighbors enforcement, I think it would be very confusing to folks saying, oh, this neighbor rents both, but, yet they were part of the grandfathered in package, not the new one. So I think that's another reason to not put the onus on the neighbors for enforcement. But I get the part of the reasoning why to keep them separate. There are 180 of them. That's kind of a lot. So just my thoughts.
Thank you. Councilmember Cuesta.
Thank you. Based upon the same question, which is a good one, I like the simplicity of one rule book that everybody has to follow. Are you aware offhand even there's the 650 square foot capacity on the ADUs as well as the back 30%, I believe, of the property under the proposed, or the 180 that exist now? Are you aware of any that are over 650 or placed strangely where they might be more to the front of the lot, where they would immediately be out of compliance if they were to be brought in under the new rules?
The vast majority of them are within that 0 to 650 square feet. There are I would say maybe 10% are larger than that. And most of them would probably, I believe the majority of them would conform to the rear 35% of the lot.
35, thank you. On that same question, what would the incentive be? If you're not playing by any rules now and you're part of that 180, would there be an incentive for them to come under whatever?
Only if they wanted to make their ADU bigger, expand it.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just a point of information, that's the reason I asked the question is because some of these people are telling me they don't believe they can upgrade at all. And if that's not true, I'd like that information.
Thank you.
Just another thought on that. I could see that argument because I used to rent one in Inglewood, and it was kind of exactly like we've laid out, but it was 500 square feet. So in order to make it larger, they would need to come into compliance with these regulations. So I understand that perspective too.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all the work you've done. Do you have enough information now to bring back the few things that council has asked for?
Yes, I think your comments were clear, and I think we understand your positions. So, thank you.
Thank you very much for everything you did to put all of this together and for working with us as well.
Thank you.
We are a little bit early to this point. Would council like to take a break before we go with the strategic planning piece?
Would love to. Take
Okay, all right, we'll take a 5-minute, actually be back
Right.
at 20 after.
Yeah, he's out in the hallway.
I don't know if you did or not. I think my brain is just so Mine is. I am getting very into that topic and pushing from my side to get some answers. One of the things that's hard to see. A lot of it when Eric and I are trying to work in partnership to move us past all this. People are asking great questions, but moving past the it's yeah. So I'm actually interested because what I've been doing my extra time for the last 3 weeks is that very topic. I think that's
We're getting there.
Getting there.
This strategic plan thing.
Yeah, hopefully this will help.
Oh, I love it.
I do too. I have to tell you, I'm grieving just a little bit that it's cold.
But it's only one night, isn't it?
Has it been back down? Because
I didn't hear. I'm going to be out of town, so.
I took 2 nights and I asked Dugan to take a night, so.
I think what it is, this is what I think it is. I think it's Tuesday the 7th. They're doing all the interviews. And June the 11th, during the study session, we're going to talk about, is the 11th on Monday or no? I didn't look.
Pull my calendar up.
Okay.
So, and she wasn't. Yeah, she was in a dentist appointment that went half the day.
She had texted me.
Oh, okay. So she decided she wasn't going to make it.
I have it down for Tuesday the 5th, Thursday the 7th, and
I think this just set. So Amy, how was it living in an 80?
right off the calendar.
I loved it. It was in a place right next door to my grandma, so it was perfect. I could keep an eye on her, and when she fell, I knew, like, she fell outside, and I knew, and it was great. I mean, we shared responsibility of the lawn and the trash, and I had a big yard and all the trees.
So what day is the 11th?
It was good.
It was Monday night.
Had a good landlord, and both
And
of the units were
that
rented,
was
so
mine.
it wasn't owner-occupied.
I have been known to be wrong.
Sometimes it was
Okay.
a little odd
But I think
sharing the
I
trash
really
and
want
water
you to be
bill
right.
with the neighbor.
Then there was a fatality.
But other than that,
Okay, I think we talked this afternoon, and so he said he was going to talk about it tonight. So,
That's very upset. I mean, I told them that the police were by there and that they didn't see it. 5, so.
okay. All right, thank you. We'll call this meeting back to order, and we are moving on to agenda item 4, prioritization of council strategic plan. Assistant City Manager Woulf is here to discuss a methodology for assisting council in the prioritization of strategic objectives within the council's draft strategic plan. Good evening, Mr. Woulf.
Good evening. Here to talk to you tonight about your strategic plan. Where we left it last time, we talked through kind of where you all were at with your strategic objectives, and what I gleaned from that, some language changes, but mostly a need for requests to spend some time trying to prioritize those objectives. So after thinking about it for some time, I thought maybe the best way to do that, instead of trying to walk through each strategic objective in a meeting and prioritize, is to allow you some time to do so and give you some suggestions for tools on how to do that prioritization. So I'll walk through a suggestion tonight, and happy to make any changes or additions for you. So hopefully it's helpful. Walk through a couple of examples. In your packets this evening, in addition to the presentation that we'll go through, are the prioritization matrices, which we'll walk through. The updated version 2 of your strategic plan with some language cleanup based on your comments from last meeting, which I'll apologize, there is a typo in there under 2.8, strong infrastructure and community parks. It says improve walkability and bike path access matrices. That was me spell checking matrices and forgot to remove that from the Word document I was working off of. So you did not add that, I did. That shouldn't be in there. And then your version 1, which we have the pretty version, I'll call it, which gives you the compare and contrast from the language that I cleaned up from our meeting last time. And then lastly, I just included the raw notes from your session on May 5th. All right. So going through tonight, really quick review of progress. I'll introduce the tool for you to prioritize your prioritization of your strategic plan, and then we'll take a couple examples just to make sure everybody understands how to use them and discuss next steps. We already went through these items, but basically This hopefully will help you get to the point where you can have a document that means something. Ideally, we'll come back maybe in 2 weeks and allow you to have a chance to look at this. I'll also be respectful of your new member potentially will have a chance to take a look at the work that this group has done and get up to speed and maybe participate in the prioritization, which would be nice to make sure you have one document that everybody can buy into going forward. All right, so there's many different mechanisms to do some type of prioritization. I didn't pick necessarily my favorites. I tried to include items that I thought that this council was more concerned with than others, so really focusing on the budget impact, the overall effort, resource availability, and looking at potential risk of not doing the objective. I think it's easier to use some type of tool. That's how my brain works. Maybe there's another way out there. Certainly we could go through the whole process of setting aside a little extra time, whether it's in this room or another special session, and do more of a workshop. I'm certainly open to helping you out with that if that's the direction you'd like to go. Thought maybe a lighter, since you're very familiar with these objectives already, give you a framework to work on over the next couple weeks, assign you some homework, if you will, and bring back and discuss it from there. So we can talk through that if that makes sense, but I figured this would be a decent place to start our discussion tonight. So essentially what I've proposed to you is to utilize 3 different matrices to evaluate each of the strategic objectives within the plan. And that's, I think, 35 objectives that you've identified so far. Effort and cost versus impact is the first. The urgency of the objective versus the availability of resources. And then looking at the other side of the coin, the cost of inaction versus the risk of negative impact. So kind of looking at that. What if we don't do this particular objective? The way that I've designed the matrices in your packet provide some type of scoring mechanism, so everybody's able to compile their results and then share them, and then we can talk about them, and it gives us a ranking. It's informal. Are we going to know the exact costs and whether or not that's a 2 to 3 on the scale, as we'll talk about? No, but at least it's a discussion point and a place to start, as opposed to debating, well, is this more important than that every single time you're going through each objective. So hopefully it takes all of your 35 strategic objectives and re-ranks them, so to speak, or puts them in some order based on your individual results, and then compile your aggregate results so we can take a look at where the group's at overall. It is not a science, but at least it gives you a place to start. All right, so looking at the first, this looks at effort and cost versus impact. This is what your facilitator, David Marvin, did, minus the cost, looking at effort impact with the bold-faced objectives, your top priorities that you identified on May 5th. So you've already looked at a similar scale. What I'll point out is that since we've had so much discussion about potential budget impact of these objectives, is to consider effort and cost, so staff time included in that. Effort, maybe it's more of a policy issue that will take a lot of effort and time to talk with the community and go through this body, so that could be included. Maybe that's low cost, but high effort. Maybe the effort to, in terms of staff is low, but we know that the cost of implementation is really high. So trying to include both of those in the same for this in the inverse. So you'll notice on the left side of the matrix, 1 is high effort, high cost, and on the other end is the low. That's the only inverse that you'll see in the 3. And then looking at potential for positive impact. And again, loosely defined, but generally speaking, looking at positive impact on the community. And I'll explain the 1s and the 2s and the 3s in a moment, but that's going to be your scoring mechanism. So you kind of look at, well, I think that this objective X, will have a really high effort, but it's also going to have high potential impact on the community. Well, you check the box for high, and that would be a 2. And so we'll go through how that translates, but essentially you would be keeping track of your strategic objectives that way. And we will walk through a couple quick examples. Matrix number 2 is looking at urgency versus the availability of resources. So again, there's a number of different ways to analyze objectives, but certainly one, if you're looking at, well, what is our low-hanging fruit, so to speak, perhaps that you start getting at that by looking at what is our availability of resources. Do we have it budgeted? Do we have the staff time? Whatever that might be. If you're looking at that against urgency, you start to get at some of those areas where maybe the community's really demanded it. Maybe it's a regulation. Maybe we have to do it. So it gives you an idea of looking at, well, maybe the community said absolutely we want this, but we don't have the resources. So that might be high urgency but low availability of resources. We have to have a conversation about how to increase those resources. For now, I'm going to rank that at 2. So you can kind of see based off of that box that you're looking at trade-offs between demand or urgency and availability. And lastly, this kind of tries to look at it from a little bit different perspective, the objectives, where what happens if we don't do this objective. So it's on the list for a reason. We've talked through it. We said, yeah, this is really important. Of all the things that a city does, it's one of the 35 that this council has said is important. So what happens if we don't do that, if we're trying to figure out of those 35, what are the most important? So looking at risk of negative impact, so that could be, that's overall negative impact on the community. So what is the risk factor? So and we'll go through a couple examples because I think this one in particular is better in demonstration. But if you think about, maybe a large natural disaster, given where we sit, maybe the risk is on the low side, but the cost of that could be really high. So if you're thinking about it narrowly like that, maybe you're looking at something that is on the less risky side to not do something about it, but perhaps the cost of that inaction is really high. So this gives you a little bit different perspective depending on the objective. So we'll go through a couple examples. I will say that what I hope happens, given our conversation last time, is that some of these objectives, given how they're worded currently, will be really difficult to place in a matrix, in these 3. And that's okay. What I think that will tell you is that some of the wording is not as actionable as I think would be helpful in a strategic plan. So we can kind of use that and say, hey, I really had a difficult time with 2.4. And we can examine that and say, okay, well, we see why. Some of those we already know. We talked through. It was more of, well, we really need to have a discussion about how we deal with prioritization within the comp plan. We know that. That's going to be really hard to put on a matrix. That's okay. We just need to come up with an action plan on how to address some of those issues or alter some of the language in your plan so that it gives us an idea on how to implement your strategic plan. Okay. Any questions before we go through the few examples here?
Can I ask a question? Actually, this takes us farther into the packet a little bit about in the 2018-19 Council Strategic Plan, are the objectives themselves in priority order?
Right now, your strategic objectives are only in priority order based off of the exercise, the DOT exercise that you all participated in on May 5th. So the bolded items were the quote, top vote getters that you spent extra time looking at effort and impact. Other than that, there is no priority order. And the overall categories, your goals and themes, the safe, fun, active, and engaged community, strong infrastructure, and community parks, are not identified by priority area. They're just in a list.
So is there benefit in prioritizing those or will they rise to the top by the things in it? I mean, I think we need the overall thing in priority order also.
Yes, and I think you'll get some of both. On one hand, you do need to have a separate discussion at some point on how to order those 6 themes or goals based on your scoring, hopefully, of the total package, the 35 strategic objectives. If 5 in safe, fun, active, and engaged community rise to the top, well, obviously that one is going to carry more weight for this group. So I think it'll help you there too.
But my question is, there may be things that are actually more necessary that don't rise to the top and need to be the top priority. I mean, that is a possibility.
Yes, and like I said, this is not going to, it's not a hard science. It hopefully will help you start moving down the road towards adopting a strategic plan, giving us some guidance on how to implement your plan. But you could certainly come to the end of this exercise and say, well, geez, I mean, we must have all just kind of missed that this needs to happen. And so, and that's totally reasonable.
Okay. Okay. Councilmember Olson.
So I like the question you're asking. I would think these 3 would make it come to the top, but if it doesn't, if you have one in mind, we ought to test it out tonight.
Okay. I mean, what I'm thinking, I really do believe that safe, fun, healthy community needs to rise to the top, because I do believe that we need to be a safe community.
So you mean as the 6th, that would be your top one, but as
Right,
a
of the
general
6,
category.
as a general category, yes. And I mean, I guess it is possible that it will rise to the top when we do the exercise. So that's the example that I was using. Okay, so are there any other comments or questions, or we'll just move on? Okay.
Great.
Thank you.
So figured it would be helpful to walk through a couple examples. We don't have to come to agreement around the table on where these fall, but I think just as a general exercise, if some participation on each of these would be nice to walk through. So objective 2.1, I just picked one here. Develop, well, I picked one of the more important ones. Develop a council-approved tool or matrix to prioritize capital projects. So I think I'll walk back through the slides with the matrices on here. So the objective is develop a council-approved tool matrix to prioritize capital projects. Anybody want to kick off where they think this lands in effort and cost versus positive impact to the community?
So we're applying matrix 1 to objective 2.1.
Correct.
So I think it would be high effort and high impact, so I guess that would make it, in my estimation, a 2.
I wasn't sure that the effort would be high. I thought it might be medium, but I think this is one of those where our staff have to say, it's going to take a lot of time, or, no, it won't be that bad, we've done it already. Then it might shift that. So, but I do think it would have high impact.
Councilmember Costa?
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. I would agree with the high impact, and medium comes to mind for me as well, but I would beg your guys' correction. Is that not the case?
I think you're correct. Counselor, you're correct in that right now we're actually baking in the cost of our capital projects into the CIP itself. So for certain projects, it's going to be more intensive for project management than others. And so in this particular issue, we're trying to create a project management office. I think a medium cost is probably appropriate.
Well,
Councilmember
I guess what's a medium cost then, too? While we're
Yeah, well, and again, I think as we start to look at each individual project, you have projects in the city right now that range from $10,000 to $27 million,
Sure.
Being the police building. And so I think you have to look at the relative comparison of the cost for project management. So for a $27 million project at the police building, your contract with CBRE is about $400,000 for project management for that 2-year period. So in comparison to small projects, such as implementation of a new copying or new scanning and document management system, which is a lot less. It's about the same percentage of effort going forward. And so, again, what we try to do for these projects is to bake in that project management cost into the project itself, so that we're not having to come to council and say, hey, we need money to create X number of positions. I think where we can, what we're trying to do is to rely upon staffing that we can ramp up and ramp back down as necessary through contracts and things like that for management of projects if it can't be done in-house. So medium cost for a $10,000 project, you're probably looking at maybe $1,000 of project management time, $1,500.
Point of information. But we're not looking at projects specifically on this one. We're looking at developing out a matrix or tool.
Right. And in this
So
particular...
that wouldn't be one project or another. It's how long will it take you to create an entire tool for this? So that's...
The tool itself is relatively simple. So I think the low, medium effort on that. And I think perhaps what Manager Keck's comments indicate is that on that matrix number 3, where you're really looking at what happens if we don't have a mechanism to prioritize our capital projects, where is that impact? Where is that potential cost of inaction? And
You're on matrix 3 now.
Right,
Okay.
exactly. So
okay.
I think
Confused.
Yeah.
I think by focusing on the words, the specific words in your objective will be helpful, because if it's not there, then it doesn't give us a good sense of where this council wants to go with that objective. If the words are there, then we'll try to take it as literally as we can.
Okay, but so on this one, is there a financial cost to creating a tool and a matrix? That's what this is begging
Right.
for.
Only in the amount of staff time that it would
Okay.
take to create.
Right.
Thank you. Councilmember Barentine?
I think the city manager made the comment that they were looking at putting together a department for capital improvement. We need to know that, because it can't be separate really from what we're doing with this. And so that plays into it. We can't do just that one piece of it without understanding that there may be more staff that is going to come out of this. I mean, they can't be devoid of each other. They can't be distanced from each other. That just wouldn't make sense. So to do that process over here, and that's the first time I'm hearing that we're doing more of a department thing. I mean, so we need to make sure that we're putting all of that in. That is a lot more cost and would make a lot of difference to how we're handling it. So I want to make sure that we're making sure all the players are pieced to this. Otherwise, we're spinning our wheels.
Thank you.
Well, that's
City Manager?
Yeah, just to clarify, Mayor, Councilmember Barentine's right. We haven't had this discussion before because we've seen it as more of an internal administrative function. It's not a department per se, it's a project management office. And so we have an existing employee who you've got to meet and deal with quite a bit lately as our acting public works director, who has skills in running project management. So he would be in charge of a project management office, which, again, rather than bring additional overhead to the city for projects, in other words, hiring additional employees to manage projects, what we will do is, again, included in the CIP itself, a proportion of each project cost will have a proportionate share of project management within it. So that's the goal. But Councilmember Barentine's right. We really haven't got into that to just come to you and describe that. That's a preview of coming attractions for the budget to talk to you about how we're going to get this done. So I apologize for the confusion on the effort and cost. As Mr. Woulf has mentioned, to put something like this together is a medium effort. There is some cost because it's an opportunity cost. If I'm assigning Mark and or Larry Nimmo, who has experience in putting together project management programs and processes, there's a cost to them doing that versus other work. But it will have a high impact.
Any other comments or questions? And I guess on this piece also, I didn't necessarily understand, like, capital improvement projects, planning and zoning is also responsible for that, correct?
they are responsible for looking at the 5-year CIP and then looking at it and making suggestions for other projects that might not be on that list, or a prioritization of projects that comes to you for council to deal with as part of its CIP budget, which again we'll be discussing with the council on 11th of June. P&Z will be looking at it at their June 5th meeting, which is next Tuesday.
Okay.
Yeah, they're not tasked with coming up with a whole CIP on their own. Their task is to review the CIP created by the city and brought forward.
Okay. So are there other areas that we're looking at that will change? I mean, as far as us doing this project, and then there's other things already in the plans that will change the outcome of council doing this?
The quick answer is no. We already have an enunciation of projects that need to happen. The issue now is having council help us to prioritize the projects that are within that capital schedule itself. So what we're trying to do multiple things at the same time. Mm-hmm. We're building the airplane while we're flying it. And so what we're trying to glean from council or obtain from you are some priority pointers, if you will, for projects that are in the mix now. So heretofore, we've used the schedule to say we're going to only do capital projects that have a public safety component to it. Those are the top priority projects. Beyond that, if it's aesthetics or if it's asset reinvigoration, revitalization from the standpoint of functionality that doesn't impact safety, those come secondary to public safeties first. So right now, when we're talking about projects where, as you know, we've been doing a lot of roadway work, bridge work, such as the IGA that you recently approved with CDOT for the Dartmouth Bridge so that nobody's axles go through the bridge deck. We're talking about looking at replacement of playground equipment that is beyond its useful life or has some safety concerns, such as what we just recently did at Rotolo and what we'll be doing at Jason. So those are public safety type things. Beyond that, I think what we want to gain from council is some other sort of mechanism or rubric, to use Dr. Olson's favorite term, for evaluating projects and determining which ones we're going to do, because we do have a limited funding level, about $6 million a year.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
And each of these brings very interesting discussion. and Manager Keck points out something important, is that we are trying to, we're both and right now. We were hoping to get an adopted strategic plan prior to the budget development so that we had your priorities baked in. We don't have that luxury, and that's okay. What we're trying to do is get as close to where we think you're going with your strategic plan as we're developing the budget. And the capital budget is obviously the big ticket item, if you will. We have to pare down what is $75 million of need approximately over 5 years in the capital improvement plan to what is our actual available projected budget without any assumption of increase of revenue anywhere. So we have to have a mechanism in order to do that, and that's where this matrix or rubric comes in. And so that's where we were hoping to have that discussion sooner rather than later, so that when we do make those decisions and present them to you as a proposed budget, you understand why or how we arrived at that.
Thank you. Councilmember Olson.
I really like these matrices, so let's keep moving on them.
Got it.
I didn't mean to sidetrack us with some of that.
That's all right. It was our first one.
I think it's going to help, and you're right, it's not a science, it's a bit of an art, too, and we're going to find out differences between us.
So let's say this one was a 3 for the group. High potential impact, and we'll say medium effort and cost. So same initiative, develop a council-approved tool or matrix to prioritize capital projects, urgency, and the availability of resources.
High priority or high urgency, probably.
Want us to use the sticks or not? No? We're just having our conversation.
Oh, yes.
Well, she was actually chiming in. I think she's got.
Yeah, I was Councilmember Olson.
Oh, were you going
Go
to
ahead.
give your? So I can see high, but then I don't know how to answer the second one either. Like, I don't know
Yeah.
what the resources that are available for
Right.
this. So that's where some of these are going to be harder to figure out.
Yeah,
Is
I
that what you're
agree.
thinking?
Yes, that's
Yeah.
what I'm thinking.
At the high.
Agreed.
And I do think that as you go through each of the objectives, if you have questions for staff or not sure about where you'd rate it because of those questions, make sure to note that, compile that. We can talk a little bit about what's the best way to collect that information, make sure the public has that information. But certainly to help expedite this, we're more than happy to answer those questions as we need to. So maybe medium, I'd say, availability of resources for that. Obviously, we will do as requested, but high urgency potentially given our budget issues. So maybe a 3 there as well. And then looking at the cost of inaction or risk. So risk of negative impact versus the potential cost.
So I have a question on this one. So this is a little bit, it's taken me a minute to wrap my brain around this because it's thinking of things in a negative way. So risk of negative impact. So that's like, if you don't do anything, if it's a high risk, it's a high negative impact?
Only a high risk.
Okay.
So the focus of the bottom is the risk of,
Risk.
Yep,
Okay.
the risk of impact, if you think about it that way. And then what is the scale of that risk, or the cost, the scope of that impact? So if it's risk of impact, what's the scope of impact is the cost.
So I think in this case, for this first one we're giving an example of, I think it would be high and high of not doing anything.
I agree.
Okay. So if this group, let's say those were all 3s, your total score for those for this particular objective would be 9, and you'd note that, and we'd have everybody score and be able to compile them as such. That's the highest potential score for one of these, and you'll see with other examples here, as we'll go through really quickly, it may not rise to that level. So potentially for this group, that is a real high priority. So, and we don't have to do all 3 of these, but we can do number 2. Hopefully some of these become self-evident. We don't have to walk through each one. Perhaps some of these others are, less of an impact, but maybe the resources aren't there. Maybe they're a little bit more pricey, and all of a sudden you start walking back from that 9 out of 9, and you're in the 7 out of 9 category and that type of thing. Maybe you have some questions that need clarification. Absolutely happy to do that. But as you go through this, the point is that you'd have a compiled score where each of you would have your list of priorities based on your score, and then the group would have an overall list. And so I just made up scores here on this next slide, but you see how that might happen.
Councilmember Olson.
You did make up scores? That
Yeah, I
isn't
made
what
up
you were
scores.
guessing? I was trying to figure out which 2 you decided it was. High, low? Medium, or? So,
I didn't spend much time
You didn't?
guessing, no.
because I wanted to know, if you did, I wanted to know how you got a 2, because I'm not sure I understand how you'd weigh this one. So to hear you think it out loud, if you randomly just gave it 2, then don't do it. But if you did kind of give it a minute, I'd like to hear how you reasoned it.
The last one,
Yeah.
Sure. I think the only way I could justify that is to say that the way that we prioritize our capital projects at the moment, as Manager Keck articulated, is based off of public safety. And so we're trying to mitigate risk based on how we, basically stretch $5 or $6 million every year. So I think we would say that there's certainly risk. Whether or not there's high risk at this point, that's where maybe I could see a medium. Again, the cost depends. It depends on major policy decisions that would be accompanied a lower capital budget, so getting out of the business of some of our largest infrastructure that are in need. So again, maybe the cost isn't great, but that depends on your perspective. If I'm somebody that uses the recreation center every day and we no longer are in the business of recreation centers, well, the cost is much higher than where I sit. So that's a lot of caveats, but
No, that's helpful because I think I'm still stuck on the objective is develop a council-approved tool
right.
or matrix to prioritize capital projects. We've never had one, so really no risk, no cost if we don't do it. I mean, it's status quo. We're trying to do something more progressive, more proactive in developing something so we don't do brain damage every single time we go through this.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, the risk is we'll just keep doing the same thing over and over. It's a lack of innovation. Right. It's a lack of thinking more strategically.
Yep.
So maybe it is a 2-2, but I wasn't thinking about very specific things. It's the tool itself we're asking ourselves to do.
Right, and I would encourage you as best you can to try to focus on what the objective is on paper, because especially for this last one, you start to get into the what ifs. What if this happens? Why? 5 whys. You go down many different potential rabbit trails. But the point is that I think it's a good exercise to get your brain wrapped around, well, now that I think about it this way, I'm not used to thinking about things in the negative. Maybe this is more important. Or maybe, if we miss out on the opportunity of a matrix this year, well, we know there's at least something in place that staff does to evaluate capital projects. Maybe if it's going to spend a lot of effort on it, maybe we need to move on to something else. I'm not saying you should do that, but using this as a mechanism to think through different things, take notes, write questions down, I think that helps try to move you forward a bit. Otherwise, we could have this discussion on each of the objectives all over again without giving you all a chance to think about them in a meaningful way.
Thanks. I think that answers it. I think you have to really read the objective itself and make sure that's what you're evaluating, not whether it's a park or not. It's the very general thing of developing a tool, which isn't really very costly.
Right.
It'll take time.
Right.
Thank you. Councilmember Barentine.
I think that's what we agreed to do when we did this strategic planning, was to go ahead and start providing leadership for staff rather than constantly looking at staff and asking them and putting them in an awkward position to tell us what to do, and that's kind of where the wheels keep spinning there. So I agree with this as a tool. I think I understand how it works.
Good.
Just fine. I don't want to get into the habit of developing a tool that council is supposed to use to facilitate discussion amongst us, and then keep, just deferring to you guys and asking you to do our job for us. So I appreciate the tool that you've come up with. I don't need to go through the other examples, or nor am I going to put you on the spot on how you rated anything, because we're supposed to be trying to make sure that we're providing the leadership. I think we heard that very clear from the city manager, is that you wanted that direction, and it is sometimes our fallback to just go, well, what do you guys want? I mean, we're taking that into consideration. We're not ignoring that, but we like to keep saying, well, you're the expert, so you do well, but then we're not carrying our load either of this. So I appreciate the work that you've done with coming up with this. I understand the concept of how this works. It's just the opportunity for us to go ahead and work with each other to get this done.
Thank you. Councilmember Martinez.
Thank you. Thank you for all the work that you've done on this. I really like the 3 different layers. It's going to be really helpful for me to evaluate it through looking through 3 different lenses. I think it's going to help me be a lot more objective when I evaluate that. So you want us to do this on our own for each of them and then turn them in, send them to you by a certain date?
Yes, and I'll follow up with council with a specific email with some instructions, just so you have them, not just verbally. Perhaps if we had them by Wednesday prior to June 11th, whatever date that might be. I think it's the 6th. So
next Wednesday.
we have it by then,
Wait
we
a
can.
second, you just said June 11th, and you said, is that prior to the 6th? June
So-
11th after the 6th? or
Yeah, June 11th is your,
The Wednesday prior
is
to the
your study session. So if we had them the Wednesday prior on June 6th.
Oh, I see
yeah.
what you were saying. I was like, no, the 6th still comes before the 11th. I was getting confused. Thank you. So you were just talking about the study session versus a council. Okay.
Correct. Yes.
Councilmember Olson.
Thank you for clarification.
Could you or will you be creating like an Excel sheet or a table that, and then have a place where we can put in comments
happy to do
that
so.
qualifies? That'd be great. Because I can see the questions getting lost that we might have if we don't have some kind of coordinated tool. Thanks. I really like this. I love the 3 different ones that you picked, and I think it'll be really useful.
Great. Just making sure I didn't miss anything. And again, just to reiterate, there will be some that will be very hard to score. So if you feel like you can't enter a score, don't, and then note it, and we can discuss it then on the 11th.
Well, and that too, we may come up with like, oh, that's not going to take very much at all, where you're going to need to say, oh no, that will take a lot.
Right.
so
Happy to tell you.
yeah, good.
Or the need for more information.
Yes.
Absolutely.
I assume if somebody can't score, it's because we need.
That's why I was asking the questions I was asking earlier.
Yes, and I would
Oh, yeah, I definitely thought that's why you were asking, but I wanted to remind him.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep, and I would just ask that you bear with us that it's beginning on June 11th, we'll also be starting to dive into the budget a little bit in more detail. So we'll be doing our best, but it'll be a heavy focus on the capital budget on the 11th, and so we'll just have to adjust accordingly. So
Safe and healthy.
Thank you.
thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Moving on to agenda item 5, council members' choice, and I just want to start out with a couple of things. In the charter, it specifically states that we will install new council members at 8 o'clock in the evening. And so it has been suggested that we start later instead of 7, perhaps 7:30. Is there any feedback on that?
Follow the charter.
Councilmember Olson.
Well, first of all, I don't think we've ever done it at 8 o'clock, really.
Oh, yeah.
But I'm fine
So-
with adjusting the time to make it work.
Works for me.
It's just strange.
Okay, so we will start the regular city council meeting at 7:30 next week. Then also, do we need to reappoint council liaisons? I mean, are there any liaisons that each of us are filling that perhaps we would be willing to let go? Shall we talk about that? Councilmember Barentine.
Go ahead and just put that in for the city manager, like similar to what we've done before, people who weren't interested in or maybe couldn't do, so that we could at least have a list of things that might be open for discussion rather than do that right now.
Okay.
We'll submit that. Is everybody okay with that, doing
So
that?
submit an email to you saying I'd be willing to give up this one or this one or this one.
Yeah, or exactly. Or if you're not able to adequately address a meeting because you've got 3 meetings in the same night, or whatever it might be. So just let me know, and I can put together a matrix that I can share back with the council.
Amy does know what that's like, don't
I do.
Yeah, yeah, that's why I pointed to her.
Okay, Councilmember Olson.
This is another way to go at it. I don't know if we have an updated list of what everyone is on.
That's a good
Could
idea.
we
I
get
think-
that to begin with? Because I was calling in that night, and I was never sure what all Mr. Cuesta or Ms. Wink got. So I think I'm unclear, but I'm sure we have it somewhere. Can you just
Yes,
resend it to
and
us?
Yes,
actually,
I'll send
you
it
could
out.
take.
Resend it to us. That'd be great. Thanks.
You bet.
Okay, any other questions or comments about that? Let's see. The other thing, I had laid some leaflets on in front of each of you, kind Congresswoman DeGette sent those to me, and so I just divided them up equally between the council members. And she also sent a letter to us just summarizing the things that we talked about, and I'm willing to pass this around and share it with who, so, or, I mean, I could read it, I mean.
Would you PDF it and just send it to us?
Sure. Okay. All right. Perfect. The ADU meeting went very well. I was very pleased with staff and all the work they did to prepare for that. And so, and the Veterans Memorial went very well this year. I think it was a little bit shorter than the previous year. And that was really their goal, to cut down the amount of time. So, but it was a very good program. So, appreciate that. All right, who would like to start? Councilmember Bernstein.
I've been a little out of it. I was unable to go to the memorial. My mother's been in the hospital, and she's having some surgery. I'm kind of a little out of it, so thank you for your indulgence. I appreciate it very much, your patience with me. But I did finally get over there and take a picture of my dad's stone. So Joseph and I did get over there. But I would like to find out about the fatality. I'm kind of a little very saddened by kind of a series of events, just human nature, and that I happened to be with my son over by King Soopers, and we saw the gentleman who was in the trash can over there, and with some other people. I think the new management over at King Soopers is doing a beautiful job, and I think that they've got a very good working relationship with the police. And so there were just some of us stopped, and we were a little not sure quite what to do. It was obvious that there was something not right going on, but because he was throwing trash out and looking in the trash and kind of had his pants half down, and that always gets people's attention. And we saw an officer come by, and some people were going to go and address him. But when the officer just slowed down, and then I found out now had another call, and there was no reason to think the man was in distress or anything. I mean, he wasn't acting normal, but not like he was. You would think that he needed immediate medical attention. And when that happened, all of us were just kind of like, okay, we're going to let this go, because the police are obviously aware of it, and we left. And then come to find out later, probably very, very shortly after that, the man passed away. And I'm sorry we didn't do anything. It's obvious he was homeless. And my son and I were very sad that just the series of events, we all kind of went, okay, I guess we're not, we just didn't do anything. And it's not like the police would have known or not known, but we did kind of take our cue from that, because, you have an authority, and then you go, well, we're not going to get involved with that. So it was just human nature in a series of events. It wasn't ill on anybody's piece on that. But I was very sad to hear that the gentleman had passed away probably shortly after we were there. It's not, you always think that you could have done something, or that if you'd have paid attention or better or whatever.
Right.
And so I'm very sad about the situations that we have going on. That's a human being, and certainly there were some other people there, and it's kind of like that group think. You just go, we were gonna, and then we went, okay, I guess they got it handled, so we walked away from it. Not that we could have done anything better or made a difference in it, but I would like you to at least speak to that. Like I said, I was very...
Right. There were several calls that officers were responding to, and I don't know exactly what time you were there.
It's about, I don't know, 6:30, something
Okay.
like that, right after.
And I do.
It's hard to tell with the sun staying up.
Right, exactly. I know an officer did go by and had seen him there en route to another call, and then made a point when he came back by, when he saw him a second time, and this would have been later, about 7:15, that he saw him near the trash can, and so he stopped. And at that point, it was obvious that he was deceased. There was nothing suspicious on the preliminary investigation to indicate any type of foul play or anything like that. So the coroner's office responded out, and then today they did their examination. So it's going to be probably 6 to 8 weeks before we actually know a cause of death. Do know that he did have a bad heart, but the coroner didn't say that was the cause. But we'll have to wait and see those results. There was nothing suspicious at the scene, nothing suspicious identified today from the coroner's office. It's still an open investigation until we get those final results.
His behavior, I assume that he was either drunk or on drugs. I mean, and it's getting more and more of an issue. I mean, the gentleman who committed suicide on somebody's lawn, and some of the people who have been camping out like in the alley and been run over. And so we certainly want to make sure that we're protecting the community, but we want to make sure that we're watching out for each other too.
Right.
I appreciate that, and I will make sure. I really think that it should, be at least out there that the officer was going on to another call. It wasn't. It just was the appearance at that moment. It was just kind of like, because nobody knew that that's what was going on. So I hope that you put that information out there because that's important.
Well, yeah, and we typically don't release a lot of information on calls for service and that type of thing. I do know that his actions at the time caused the officer enough concern that he knew he needed to go back and see, and he did go back, and at that point the gentleman had already died.
Happens for a reason, so I appreciate that they went back as soon as, obviously they went back very quickly after that because it couldn't have been that long, but I appreciate the work that they're doing, and it's just a hard situation.
It is, yes, it is.
And some of the things that some of the businesses have done, even with the argument of some of the homeless, is really for their own benefit. I mean, I know the manager at King Soopers had to take some people from the shelter with the dumpster, and they were camping in back there. And he said when the dumpster comes, it pushes it back, and he said somebody's going to die. I mean, it's for their own, so they're mad when he's rousting them out of there, but at the same time, he said, I can't have an employee go back there, and there's a decapitated human being back there because they were sleeping back there.
Right.
So they're trying to do things in a way that it is protecting with understanding the situation that's going on as well. So my heart goes out to both sides, and certainly whatever. Thank you for that they took care of it like they did. It makes me realize how hard your job is to see these kind of things in our community. As much as it's impacted me and my son, that you guys deal with that every day. And so I realize it's a double-edged sword. Sometimes people put themselves in that situation. We're still all trying to look out for them too. So.
I appreciate that.
I'm sorry that I wasn't able to go to the Memorial Day event. I understand. I heard it was very, very nice, and I appreciate that you were able to go. I understand both the city manager and the mayor spoke, and I heard some really good feedback on it. So I'm glad that we're supporting that event. I'm also glad it didn't go 4 hours because that's a little much. So. We took some of our neighbors who are veterans to breakfast, and so That's always good. I'm just tired. Go ahead. Somebody else go. Sorry.
Councilmember Wilson, I apologize.
I wondered if this was the report, if there's more, if we can
Yes.
ask questions, or,
If you have
Yep.
questions, you can ask.
was there a 911 call? I don't know if.
I was just looking through the CAD notes. I didn't see a 911 call in the CAD notes. My understanding is that somebody had called the police, and it was as they were dispatching it, the officer was calling out on scene. So he had gone back and said, I'm on scene, just as the call for service had came out. So I don't know, I didn't see any notes in there.
But the first time he went by, he was alive. He was,
Right,
yeah.
right.
I think that's important to know that there was a call or not. I think it's always good for us to
Yeah.
see it, hear it, report it, kind of stuff to
Right,
keep
right.
reminding
And
ourselves.
the call would have come in about the same time the officer was
I'm
going
glad
back.
to hear that someone called in. Thank you. I have nothing.
Thank you. Councilmember Cuesta?
Enter the echo chamber. I too would like to thank everybody that worked on the memorial service. I thought it was great. I thought it was both somber and respectful, but also, I don't know, I left prideful in everything that everybody's done. As I look around the room, I think we have 3 veterans at least, with Mr. Keck, Mr. Adams, Mr. Russell, and I can't honor those folks enough. So I thought it was tremendous. I really liked it. It's good that it's right out front of the school, so a lot of folks will see it, I think, pretty often. At our retreat, we mentioned revisiting the comprehensive plan, and I know that we have many, many things going on, but when the opportunity arises, I'd like to go back over it with the group, and maybe even we'll have our 7th member seated soon as well, and he can give his input as well. But when the opportunity presents itself, I would like to review that with the
Okay.
group, of course.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Martinez?
Thank you. I was not able to attend the Memorial Day event, but I am looking forward to going and checking out the pavers I purchased for my family. And just want to congratulate our new 7th council member and looking forward to have a full 7 again starting next week. And that's it for me.
All right, great. I do have one question, and Mr. Keck, you may know the answer because the city attorney has some different information than me about the interviews for boards and commissions. Is that just one night or is that 2 nights?
It's one night, but on the 11th, we're trying to build in an opportunity for you so that you're not having to deliberate the same evening. So the review night would be the 11th, but the interview night is
I had all 3 of the possible dates.
Yeah,
So the mayor made me so happy when she says, no, it's not 3, it's 1.
No, only one night, and I think it is the
Thursday this.
the 7th. Is that right? Yeah, because
I think it's the Tuesday.
I'm sorry, it's Tuesday.
Tuesday the 5th, yeah.
it's the 5th.
At 5:30.
Yes. And so we're a little tricky here because Krista's off on vacation this week. There is one individual that could not make it on the 5th or that week at all. And so we also wanted to indulge the council or see if the council was willing to meet with this individual prior to the study session on the Monday, the 11th, to do a quick interview. And then you'd have an opportunity to also deliberate at that particular study meeting with all the potential citizens that you've interviewed to review for a recommendation for appointment to those boards and commissions.
Do the TV thing?
You're not available that week. It
Apparently
sounds like.
not.
How many applicants do we have? Do we know?
You've got, I think there are 15 total,
Okay.
or 14 slots for 15 people.
Okay. And then so we're going to interview. We're going to interview on the 5th,
Sounds like musical chairs.
Yeah.
and then deliberate on the 11th,
Correct.
and then vote the following.
Appointment
Meeting?
would be you have,
2 weeks later.
yeah, you have the ability on the 18th, or you have the ability on that first meeting in July. What we did not want to do is to have any boards and commissions that would have members exiting and not having enough for a quorum
Right.
for their first meetings in July. We will be providing to you next Monday evening at the council meeting all the applications, so that you have the opportunity to review them. Again, Krista was really struggling to get with all the people over the last 2 weeks. You'd think it would be quick, but calling all these different disparate candidates and making sure they'd sign up for a time was difficult for her. But she'll have those those applications ready for you to review next Monday night.
And we'll have a list of the vacancies.
Correct.
Soon.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councilmember Olson?
I thought I heard a question there, so I was going to answer that I don't have any trouble coming or having the 15th or whatever, 16th.
11th.
Come early, or, yeah.
Monday the
Yeah,
11th.
the
Monday the 11th, but have whoever it is that can't come. I'm fine with doing it that night.
Okay.
Glad they're willing to serve.
Yeah.
Okay,
Thank you.
great. City manager?
Again, I wanted to say thanks for those council members who were able to come to the memorial event. I thought it was very well done, and Mayor, thanks for your willingness to speak at that event. We are collaborating now going forward. Just as a reminder, this is one of our events that we participate with the Inglewood Historic Preservation Society to ensure the sustainability of this event. So we will be a perpetual sponsor of this event moving forward to ensure that we can honor again those veterans that have served in our community and beyond. So just thanks for that. Other than that, I don't have any other reports.
Thank you. City attorney?
Briefly, the questions come up regularly about the capital improvement budget and how that's developed. And several of you have called and pointed out that there's several references throughout charter. There are 3 specific references in charter about the capital improvement budget. The language in Section 95 places the responsibility for developing the capital improvement budget on the city manager. So the city manager creates the capital improvement budget. But charter states that the Planning Commission shall submit annually to the city manager a list of recommended capital improvements in their order of preferences. And if you actually read that within the context of that paragraph, that would be what recommendations they would make based upon the city plan, the master plan, which is what they create, and that's basically the sentence before that. So it seems to be that charter anticipated that the city manager would get input about what capital improvements should be funded in the next year to 2 years from the community group that is associated with the master plan. More specifically, charter provides that the Water and Sewer Board, in cooperation with the city manager, shall submit annually to the council a capital expenditure budget. If you read all of those 3, they seem to, on their face, be in conflict, but the legal rules are you interpret things so that they are not in conflict. So as I read charter intends for the city manager to actually create the capital improvement budget and bring that forward to city council. But as part of the development process, the city manager works with planning and zoning regarding their recommendations for master plan elements that may get funded sooner or later, and works with Water and Sewer Board about funding water and sewer infrastructure as well as water right acquisition. So those kind of things come out of the Water and Sewer Board. And I think that becomes more important to keep track of as we're running into the budget. So several people have asked me about that, and I just wanted to make sure everyone was aware of those elements of the budget, of the charter. Other than that, I have no additional information this evening.
Thank you. This meeting is adjourned.